Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. Um, I I've been getting a little bit more into economics lately. Thinking about economics. I think it's a very, very interesting field. I think that it has very strong relevancy to policy and law. Economics does. Often, legal solutions must be grounded in some understanding of economics, and policy solutions must be grounded in some understanding of economics. So economics is a very important discipline, and it informs, or at least should inform, both policy and law. So you know, as I think about it, I before thinking about some of these issues, I would have regarded myself as economically liberal, although I may be moving in the direction of being more fiscally conservative, just based on how I understand the economic consequentialist frameworks with that pertain to certain issues. For instance, I had this thought just now about the minimum wage, and you know, markets do seem to have have the quality of a certain degree of self correction, right? That agents within that economy, their moves within that particular game or within that particular economy, almost uh, impact each other. And based on how the actions and the responses of agents interact with each other, and sort of influence each other, there arise emergent properties from markets of self-correction, right? And that's the more philosophical description of what that oftentimes in many cases markets do manage to self-correct. And the relevance of that is that if markets can self-correct, then we can let them self-correct without employing any of the resources, any of the costs associated with government intervention, right? We can let the markets do what they do best, which is to self-correct, and we can avoid the expense of regulation, right? Um, and so I think that's an important thing to recognize, that with respect to certain things, markets do self-correct, and that uh, you know while the intentions of economic policy instituted by the government may be noble, they can have one, they could be unnecessary. They amount to an unnecessary expenditure of cost associated with legislation, regulation, and enforcement. And two, they may just be unnecessary because the market may be able to correct, in most circumstances, may be able to self-correct. One of the things that people believe in, even conservatives believe in very ardently, is a minimum wage. That employers shouldn't be able to simply charge, penury wages, or pay penury wages to maximize their profits. But if you think about it, with respect to a minimum wage, the market may self-correct a more optimal solution, right? That allows us to avoid the expensive costs associated with instituting policy, legislation, regulation, and enforcement. It may be that minimum wage law is not necessary because the market itself will produce a decent minimum wage. If the market produces a minimum wage of decency just through its own inherent mechanisms of self-correction, then we don't need policy to institute to mandate a decent minimum wage, when the market will generate a decent minimum wage through itself, through the operations of itself, without the need for any sort of intervention or regulation. And that may certainly be the case. And it would certainly be a radical position for me to take, to say that I just don't support a minimum wage. Although, while I don't take a committed stand on the minimum wage and probably lean in favor of a minimum wage regardless, I think I do lean in favor of one regardless, I remain skeptical of those that are totally committed to the minimum wage, and perhaps even those that are totally committed to no minimum wage. So I'm just maintaining a non-committal position of skepticism rather than committing myself to the affirmative or the negation. However, I do think that it may be the case that this is a simple argument. If an employer is not paying enough, then that employer won't find people to work for them, right? Um, it may be true that they're in conditions of scarcity. When job opportunities are scarce, people are forced into certain jobs. But generally speaking, people are simply not going to, and that may be the case. Often the conditions of scarcity and scarce opportunity do force people into jobs, whether or not those jobs pay adequately, right? And people can be duped into low wage. So I don't really think the market self corrects to ensure. I think there does need to be a minimum wage um, regulation as opposed to just a market self generated minimum wage. I think there probably needs to be. But regardless, it's important to be skeptical of any position that you might lean toward or take to ensure that you're taking the proper position. So, yeah, I do think so. So, and the argument goes, if employers are not paying enough, then they won't find people to work for them, right? Theoretically, that seems sensible. Um, but as I said, there are limited job opportunities for many people, and they'd be forced by scarcity into these jobs regardless. However, I think the argument is still pretty strong that if you're not paying enough, you're not going to find people to work for you. So you're going to have to pay a decent wage to ensure that you can actually find employees who, if they don't find your wage decent or adequate, will simply go work for someone else that does pay more or does pay adequately. And so, in this way, competitor corporations and competitor businesses and competitor employers are going to compete with each other to provide. Theoretically, they would compete to each other with each other for the most to generate the most decent and adequate wage, the best wage, to ensure they have the most committed employees, which ultimately boosts morale and strengthens the whole integrity of the corporate and business and economic operation. Theoretically, all of that seems very sensible to me, although I think that there's a difference between theory and reality. Theoretically, if you don't pay enough, people won't work for you. They'll go work for someone who pays higher. So then you'll be forced to raise the wage to compete with those who are paying more, which ultimately, theoretically, would lead to some sort of equilibrium where the wage is decent across the board, and we don't need a policy instituted minimum wage. We just need a market self-generated minimum wage. Theoretically, all of that seems very sensible to me. And I really don't know, to be honest with you. I'll remain in a position of uncertainty as to whether I'll take a stand either or. I don't think I'm old enough yet to be able to take a stand. However, I think there's one primary negative with the minimum wage that I've detected. And I think it's this. Um, with the minimum wage, the problem with a minimum wage is that when uh, policymakers, through interventional regulation, mandate that companies pay this minimum wage, what ends up happening is then businesses, corporations, and employers are then entitled to only pay the minimum wage, right? So if in policy there's an incentive, right? So if policymakers say, okay, you only have to pay this much, well, then they're only going to pay the minimum, right? You're limiting the market's capacity to generate a better wage by incentivizing these businesses, right, to only pay the minimum that policy mandates. So when you set a minimum wage through policy, that minimum wage set is all that employers, corporations, and businesses are going to pay. Or if you left it to the market, perhaps even better wages would be generated through some sort of competitive process between employers trying to gain more commitment, more morale, and more uh, hardworking and committed employees. So the problem with the minimum wage is that once you set a minimum wage through policy, then employers, businesses, and corporations will only pay that minimum because then they have the incentive. They're justified, thus, to only pay the minimum. Whereas if you left it to the market, it's certainly possible that higher wages than the policy mandated minimum could be generated through the market, right, by itself. So, and I don't necessarily think that would happen. I think in general that's sort of an exceptional case where, and it's sort of an exceptional case because generally speaking, I'd think that the whole point of the minimum wage being established is to ensure that it's a higher minimum than the market self-generated minimum. However, I think it stands to reason that if yeah, I think it stands to reason that once policy states and mandates a certain minimum, then employers are then feel justified in only paying that minimum. Whereas if we left it to the market, sure, it might generate a less decent minimum wage and a lower minimum, but we also negate the possibility or prevent the possibility of there being a higher minimum self market self-generated wage. So that's just one of the negatives of um, that's just one of the negatives of potential negatives of a minimum wage, and I think it's something that definitely needs to be taken into account. Um, Again, I take no committed stand either way, but I still think it's an interesting point to consider. Thank you for watching.